Welcome back, friends, to episode 4 of The Heart of a Disciple. This is Lisa Martinez, the founder of Little with Great Love Restoration Ministry, which is the producer of this podcast series. The Heart of a Disciple podcast was made possible by the generosity of the following sponsors.
Hello, I'm Carol Passioni, and on behalf of the Mark D. Passioni Foundation, we are excited to sponsor this series of podcasts on The Heart of a Disciple by Bob McCarty. The Mark D. Passioni Foundation, through its Shine On grants, supports pastoral ministry to the young church. My husband, Mark, gave his entire life to the church, and he and Bob were close friends and colleagues in the Archdiocese of Baltimore and at the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry. Indeed, Mark had the heart of a disciple. His love of the church and his passion for ministry gave witness to his commitment to discipleship. May these podcasts and Bob's book support and challenge you on your spiritual journey. And please visit the Passioni Foundation website for more information about our grant process.
I'm here with two of my friends, and I'm going to introduce my teammate, Tammi McCarthy.
Hi, I'm Tammi McCarthy, contributor and podcast guest for A Little with Great Love. Also, with my ministry, Whispers of Love and Faith, we have just been barreling through these podcasts of, the heart of the disciple. We encourage you to go back, as this is podcast 4, to the other podcasts that we've done so far, and then meet back up with us. Thoughts, Bob, on this 4th podcast?
It's really great to be part of this series, and I appreciate this opportunity to unpack the book with everyone. I have to admit, though, because we're preparing for these podcasts, I've actually had to go back and reread the book several times, just so you know. It's like, oh, Lord. And so there's pluses and minuses to that, but mostly pluses, so I'm okay with that. This podcast, this series that we're going to cover during this podcast, these chapters build on those previous chapters. And so you'll see some of the themes starting to be unpacked in a little bit more depth and through different lenses. So in this chapter, we talk about a healing heart. The context goes back to previous chapters where we said, the human condition is wounded. It's just part of life. No one goes through life without getting hurt. We talked about the Paschal mystery as a way of understanding that theologically and through the lens of Jesus and his passion, death, and resurrection. So we're going to pick up on that, this whole idea of being the healing heart. And I think the first question becomes about how do we disarm our heart, which I think is a great image. How does the heart get armed in the first place? I think that's really important for us to acknowledge. How does the heart get armed? You can't talk about disarming until we understand where the initial impetus to arm our hearts, to protect ourselves, comes from. And here's what I think happens. I think there are 2 basic human needs. I think there's a need to love and a need to be loved. And I really think those human needs are really born at birth in our soul. And I think it's the mark of the Creator. Because I think of our God as a God of love. And I think of each of us in our creation, if indeed we are made in the image and likeness of God, as Genesis tells us, we are made in love and for love. So what happens? I think in life we have these experiences sometimes where we're not loved the way we need to be loved. And sometimes it's because the people we need to love us, they too are wounded. And so they can't love us the way we need to be loved. And when that happens, what do? We protect ourselves. We guard ourselves. We wrap our arms around our heart so that we don't get hurt further. That's how the heart gets armed. When we've been hurt, we protect ourselves. And I think it's a very human reaction to being hurt. Nobody wants to be hurt. Relationships end. People die. Dreams are shattered. We lose jobs. Life happens. Life includes woundedness. And so we arm our heart. We cover ourselves up. And in order to disarm, the first step, and I've always liked this phrase out of counseling, it says, You have to name it, claim it, and tame it. So you have to name the hurt, name the woundedness, name the wounds, the suffering, the pain that has caused us to pull inward. And only after we name it, then we have to own it as part of life. And only then can we begin to tame it. So we have to acknowledge that we haven't been loved the way we need it to be, and we have to move on. And so what happens then, when you think about this whole disarming thing, part of disarming means we are challenged to let go of those unhealthy attitudes that are surrounding our heart. So unhealthy attitudes, I basic one, I'm not good enough. Whatever the arena is in our life, it's relationships, it's jobs, it's whatever. I'm not good enough. I must be the cause of that lack of love. It must be my fault. I'm not good enough. That fear of failure, those kinds of attitudes can suffocate our heart if we're not careful. And so I think it's really important to be able to let go of those unhealthy attitudes, those unhealthy prejudices, even unhealthy relationships. Because we all know this intellectually, but I don't know if we know it in our heart. We can't change others. We can't, unless a person wants to change. It's up to them. Change is an individual activity, so we can't. So even letting go of that implies sometimes we got to let go of unhealthy relationships, and we have to accept, put on, we're the beloved of God. We have to accept that we are loved unconditionally by the God who created us in love and for love. I think that can be tough.
It is very tough. I think that this chapter is so special to me because it's so tied with restoration, which is the theme of our ministry, right? And also the fact that my own woundedness, I know, stopped me from becoming the person God had created me to be, and I battled with unworthiness and still sometimes battle with unworthiness. And you can hear that time and time again that, you're loved, you're lovable, if you don't believe that, it does not matter how many times you hear that, because I really believed the contrary based on my own trauma from my youth. So I had to go into that through therapy and EMDR, which is a type of therapy that I talk about on our blog, which you can read about. And there's videos I have on our YouTube channel about that. But it wasn't until I started to heal my brain, because I'd done retreats and I'd done healing the whole person. I'd done, with JP2 Center, I did a lot of things, and not to say that they weren't effective or good, but I really hadn't, I think, fully faced it, like you said, and then accepted, that was a wounded part of me that God loved, and then really let his love permeate. And I think it changed when I asked this question to God, and I said, one day I was praying and I just said, I think the Holy Spirit inspired, and I said, God, show me the truth of who you are and show me the truth of who I am, because I don't want to believe the lies anymore. I don't want to believe the counterfeit about God, because I put things on God and thought, from my woundedness, thought of him in certain ways that he wasn't really, and then put things on myself, and stuff to say that I was those ways. I am that person, when God was trying to make something new out of me. Right.
Yeah. Lisa, I think of trauma as undeserved pain. Undeserved pain. And then what undeserved pain does to us, it causes us to pull back, to lose trust, to protect ourselves. Yep. In my young adult years, one of my favorite books was called by a Jesuit, John Powell, Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am? And the really nice part of the book was that he actually answers the question in the book. He says, why am I afraid to tell you who I am? Because you may not like me, and me is all I have. And so we protect ourselves because I'm not sure we're afraid of not being accepted for who we are, with our pluses and our minuses, our limitations and our gifts. Yeah. And so we protect ourselves. And the danger here, one of the dangers here, is that it calls that kind of emotional pain, draws our attention inward. Yeah, I don't know if you thought about it this way. Pain's an interesting concept. Nobody goes running out looking for pain, but we all know physical pain is a sign that something's not working. So if you hurt your back, you hurt your neck, you hurt your knees, any kind of physical pain, you have internal pains, it says something is wrong with the system. So pain is a signal. It's a very important signal that something is wrong with our physical system. Emotional pain does the same thing. Emotional pain says something is wrong in my psyche, in my personhood, in my emotional, relational, psychological, spiritual life. Something is wrong here. And so that's why I think we have to pay attention to pain. Where's this pain coming from? Because pain shifts our focus. It says something is wrong. But now the danger is, if we're not careful, we can turn all that focus inward so much so we don't see outward. All of you listening to this podcast have had the experience of knowing that a friend is hurting. And you say to them, "What's wrong?" And their response all the time is nothing. Because sometimes our focus gets so turned inward, we can't see outward. We can't see outward that somebody else might even care about our pain.
Yeah.
And if we're not careful, that kind of focus gets frozen. And I think that's where depression comes from. It's when it's frozen. In the last podcast, we said that anger is the emotion that says our needs aren't being met. In that case, then depression can be described as frozen anger. We've turned it inward instead of outward. So I'm saying here about being a healing heart, pay attention to the suffering, pay attention to the pain, name it, claim it, and tame it. Because ultimately, I think that suffering carves out a place for wisdom. It carves out space for us for new insight if we're willing to go into the pain to see what it's telling us about ourself, about our psychic, our relational, emotional system.
I wanted to share a story with you, Bob. And I'm a person for details, but I'm gonna crunch the story so in our time here. Years ago, when I was at Franciscan and I was working with prayer teams, a gentleman came forward for prayer, and it was clear he did not want to be there. And I remember thinking, why is he here? And I'm all of 5'3", and he was about 6'1". And we asked him to sit in this chair. And I started praying over his heart. And I saw this image of a heart that had all of these locks on it, maybe 6 or 7, and all of these chains. And I thought, thanks, Lord, I'm going to deliver this message to this man who is irritable and doesn't want to be here. And this isn't a beautiful image. But I delivered it. I told him exactly what I saw. And I said, this image is showing that you are not able to give out love because of how chained your heart is, but you're also not able to receive.
Yeah.
And he just listened, and he got up and he walked away. So imagine my surprise a month later when he's in a line for prayer again. And he waves at me all excitedly. And I'm thinking, that is the man that had an attitude last time. So he comes over and it's his time for prayer. And he says, listen, I don't need prayer. I just want to tell you what happened last month. And he said, I wasn't going to come to this time of prayer. They lived about an hour away. But he was in a rough spot with his children and his grandchildren. And he said, my wife had died, and I shut my children out of my life because they reminded me of my wife. And I shut my grandchildren out because they reminded me of my kids. And he said, I was happy to just be by myself. I was so hurt. And he said, they just said, Dad, do us one favor. Would you just go with this group to this prayer time? And his prayer was, Lord, if you can reveal to me by these strangers what is happening in my heart, I will trust that you have brought me here. There goes this image. And he said, when you said what you said, I said, there's no way she could have known that. And he said, I went home a different man. And he said, I'm here today because I brought my own busload. Because it was exactly what you're describing. It says in your book, it says, until we disarm our hearts, we're not able to live authentic lives. This man was living under the heel of pain and hurt, and it had devastated his relationship with his children. And to your point, it came from this place of pain. But I think having somebody else say to him, this is your pain point, just hold all those walls down,
Yeah.
and it was just beautiful to see the different person that stood in front of me a month later.
Yeah. Tammi, you know what, when you were speaking and sharing that story, the image I have is if we are busy holding on to emotional baggage, our arms are not free to hug anyone. Our arms are
Yeah.
not free to reach out to anyone. So that image of holding on to that baggage, that's profound. So to name it, to let it go, to tame it, and move on. I mean, boy, what a great image. But I think that's what part of the spiritual journey, being a disciple, is attending to our healing heart, and not just the heart that helps heal others. Can we heal our own heart? Now, what part of my heart has to be disarmed? What do I need? What do I need to take on in order to be the disciple that Jesus called us to be? How do I live in such a way that my suffering, my woundedness becomes, we talked about this last time about how does it become redemptive like Jesus on the cross? Can it
Sure.
help me identify more clearly with the suffering of others? So I think that's a critical aspect of that healing heart.
Yeah, I agree. And I remember hearing a speaker talk about self-protection and asking God to take that down, take away my self-protection first with you, God. What ways am I not trusting you? What ways am I not surrendering with you? What ways do I feel like I still need to protect myself from you? And and then towards others, what ways am I coming in? The way that for those who weren't watching the video, that you hugged yourself, you literally are arming yourself, right? You're crossing your arms across yourself, and you can tell when someone's, just like you, Tam, what you said, you can tell when someone's shut down, shut off. And even for those of us that are in restoration or healing ministry, whatever, or you're a parent, or, whatever, when you experience people like that in life, it can be hard to break through, like how you talked about it here, that, Jesus healed holistically. He went to, the hemorrhaging woman, and he went to, the paralytic, and he went to the blind man, and he went to all these people. And those were a lot of people that I think were shut down, that were, they thought they were beyond. The guy, 38 years, I mean, he, first thing when he says, do you want to be healed? He's like, hey, I don't have anyone to take me to the water. He doesn't answer the question. He just shows he's shut down. He just tells why it can't happen. We could just spend this whole hour talking about this chapter, right? And stuff, because there's so many things. But we got to save it for you guys who are reading. But any closing points on this chapter, Bob, before we move on to 9?
We have to acknowledge that suffering is a part of life and you can't avoid it. And in fact, there's a message there. Pain calls our attention to the part of us that's hurting. And then we have to ask ourselves a question: what is it that's causing this pain? What's my reaction to that? Am I arming my heart? How do I let that go in order for healing to occur? I think that's a critical point. And I really do think it flows from the previous chapters, and it's going to lead us into the next set of chapters.
All right, let's get into chapter 9 here, which is sharing your heart. This is also another important part of our ministry, because that's what we do. We're storytellers, and we're sharing our own stories. So, Bob, can you kick us off with one of the main points for why do we have to share our hearts?
Oh, really? That's your question? I mean, we've been on this as the 4th podcast, and now you're asking me why we. Wow, that sounds like an opening line to me. Okay, I'm just kidding. I have to tell you, this is this whole image of planting seeds. It's obviously based on the parable of the sower and the seed from Luke. Right? All right, so chapter 8, it's in Luke, and so it's a great parable, and it's a great parable on several levels. And I'm going to invite you to listen. As aunts and uncles, grandparents, parents, teachers, anyone, maybe even spouses, but I'll let that go because that's a dangerous area. But the idea behind the chapter about planting seeds is, ask yourself the question: what are the values, the virtues, the attitudes that you want your children, your nieces, your nephews, the kids on the corner, the kids around the block, those people who are important to you in your life. If you're a teacher, your student, because this image of planting seeds is a wonderful image. Because I think discipleship at some point it's all about planting seeds. What are the seeds we are trying to plant in others? And then in the parable, and how does the soil condition affect that? So this whole image, we are planting seeds. I've been in pastoral ministry with youth and young adults for my whole career. And whether I'm thinking about them or I'm thinking about my own grandchildren, one of my fundamental seeds has always been, I say it in these words, I am absolutely sold on you. Because one of my learnings is that everyone needs somebody in their life who is absolutely sold on them. I am absolutely sold on you. I plant that seed as often as I can in the people whom I meet. I want them to know, I want to plant the seed, you are lovable. You are made in the image and likeness of God. My grandson, when he was like 3 or 4 years old, Thomas, he says to me, Pop, everybody loves me and I don't know why. And I said, what? I'm thinking, this is kind of brilliant for a kid. He says, everybody loves me and I don't know why. I said, Thomas, it's because you're so lovable. And he goes, okay. And well, that was it. That was that whole conversation. But the idea, the idea is that we plant seeds. And
Bob, I don't think you've ever said to me that you were sold on me.
Oh, Tammy, I am so.
I just want to. I mean, just in full clarification here. I don't think I've ever heard that.
Wow, and you know how much closer we just got to it that time with that little comment? No, I'm just kidding.
I'm gonna have to step in. I'm gonna have to step in. You go in your corner. You go.
But think about this. Think about what you're trying to sow, and then take it broader. If you're thinking as a disciple, okay, think about the seeds of compassion, inclusion, forgiveness, mercy. Think about those values of Jesus. They're the seeds that we should be trying to sow. Unconditional love. It's as basic as with Thomas, you're lovable. Okay, but how do you plant those seeds? Now, here's why it's hard for us, though. The whole parable about sowing, I believe this about anybody who's in any kind of ministry. Oftentimes, we're in the business of sowing, and sometimes we are nurturing the seeds that somebody else sowed. Rarely do we see the harvest, especially if you're working with children and youth, because oftentimes the harvest comes later. But we have to trust in the harvest. We have to trust, which is why pastoral ministry with children and youth, maybe even young adults, is so challenging, because we don't always see the harvest. We don't. Although I see it in you, so I feel a lot better about that already. But you see, and here's a technique. Here's a quick thing for you about planting seeds. The skills, I don't think it's in the chapter, but it's called effective praise. And it's one of the skills I teach in my course at Catholic University to my students. Effective praise says it's based on the idea that you catch people doing something right. Mm-hmm. We are socialized into catching people doing things wrong. Effective praise says catch them doing something right. Point that out to them, what they just did that's right. And that makes it repeatable. I'm serious about this. It's as basic as thanking somebody for a smile at the, for me being in youth ministry, teenagers, most of them are employed at fast food places. To thank somebody for taking an order with a smile, I know they're going to smile at the next couple people. The whole idea of catching people doing things right says you are paying attention to them.
I think, Tammi, you do this really well. I think that you, and you've also written a blog about like cultivating and sowing seeds and things like that. Yeah. But I think one of the things I appreciate about your friendship, is that you're really good about after we go through a situation, you break down, you always go like play by play. And then you like point out what I did that was right and good, or the revelation that God is bringing about through that, or showing me a way that I grew or something. And it really helps me to process something in a whole new way.
Your example, Lisa, of what Tammi does, That means planting seeds is a proactive experience. It's a
Yeah.
proactive skill. I think if we train ourselves for effective praise, catch people doing things right, and affirm that. And you know why? It's because initially they may not believe you. How many times have you been in a situation where somebody is paying you a compliment, and the longer the compliment, you're thinking there's a big old butt coming behind this.
Mm.
And the key about effective praise is that there's no but at all. It's just effective praise. I learned somewhere along the line that young people need a 4-to-1 ratio of affirmation to critique because they've been so critiqued in their life. 4-to-1 ratio. So I think part of planting seeds is that idea of effective praise, planting those seeds in our young people. And I said earlier, I think it works with our spouses too, but you don't want to tell them what you're doing. All right. You don't want to say, I heard this on a podcast.
I feel like I'm coming with the stories today, but here's your next one. So before I had kids back in 2003, I taught 6th grade and I was the math teacher.
Oh, wow.
And but the teacher next door was the religion teacher. So my kids would come back and it was right before lunch and they would have all these questions and they would be like, Miss M, can you talk to us a little bit about this? So right around Easter time, for about a week, I had to call down every day at lunch and say, hey, my classroom's going to stay in with me. We were having these really deep theological conversations and I just didn't want them to end. And the kids wanted to sit and talk some more. And so we were just going through all this stuff. Well, fast forward to, so that was 2003. Fast forward to maybe like 2019. I'm sitting in a pew at church and I hear Mrs. McCarthy. And there is the 20-year-old face of one of my 6th graders. And she looks at me, and as she's looking at me, she's kind of surprised, and she looks down the pew, and she says, Shayla? And she addresses my oldest. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how she knows my oldest daughter. And then all of a sudden, her name clicks, and I realize this Erin that I knew as a 6th grader has been the one that's breathing life into my teen at these youth group meetings.
Wow.
And it was a full circle moment, of just being able to sit there. And she turns to me and she says, Miss McCarthy, I just want to tell you this. She said, when I was graduating college, I had this moment where I was put back into 6th grade and all this stuff that you taught us. And I was like, I just need to live my life differently. And so she said, I've decided to kind of pour back into the church. And, at the time, this was a good 45 minutes from where I was teaching to where I was living now. It's like always gets me emotional. But I sat there and I thought, man, this is what you're talking about, Bob. You plant seeds not knowing if you'll ever see the harvest of it. And here it is for me. I didn't realize it was going to benefit my children because of who she was.
Planting seeds is a hopeful activity. We said this in the previous podcast. Hope is believing that the future can work. We plant seeds now because we know they will take root and blossom later, and they will blossom on behalf of others. But the parable reminds us we always plant seeds in soil, and there are different kinds of soil. And I think this is really important for us to hold on to the imagery. When Jesus shares the parable in Luke, he says the tramped down soil. Well, I'll bet we've all known people whose lives are tramped down. The folks who, because of previous experiences, hurts, pains, suffering, woundedness, they've armed their hearts. It's tough soil. We know that. It's difficult soil. We know that their soil. The second issue in the parable, the lack of moisture. I bet we've met the young people we've met the people who initially embrace the Word of God. But because of their surroundings, there's no support. And so that it says in the parable that the grain withers, the harvest withers because of the lack of support. The third one, Jesus talks about choked by weeds. Well, we know this. We've met the people who are choked by weeds. We know the folks who deal with addictions or difficult living situations. We know the people who try really hard, and we try to plant seeds, but we know it's a difficult challenge because of their surroundings, because of their history, because of their past life experiences. may not be ready to hear it.
Yeah.
But then Jesus always in his parable says, and you have the good soil. You have the good soil. You, like you just explained, Tammy, you plant those seeds, you nurture those seeds, you get to see a harvest. What I like about the parable, though, it's a reminder, and we said this, I think, in the last podcast. Whenever you hear one of those parables of Jesus, you got to understand what's he saying in his setting. What's it mean for our setting? What does it mean for us?
Yeah.
It's an acknowledgement, kind of like building on the healing heart. We've been tramped down soil too. At some point, I'll bet we've had that experience. We've been that soil that lacks moisture. We've had those times in our life where we may have lacked the support we needed. We've had those times in our life, maybe we've had weeds of our own that have somehow surrounded us and choked off the word of God. And then we've had those moments of harvest where we've been the good soil. And sometimes, don't you think, sometimes you've had all those soils like in the same day? I mean, really. So when you hear a parable like that, what's it mean in my setting? What's it mean in my life? Because I think we've been that. And so if there's a takeaway from that chapter, think about what seeds are you trying to plant where, and do you know about the soil? But the second thing is, and I don't know if it's as clear, who has planted seeds in you? When we pause and look backwards, who planted seeds in us? Who are the patient and the compassionate sowers along our journey? Can we name them? And even better, can we thank them?
One of the things that you said too towards the end of this chapter, as we move on, that really got me was that it might be tempting to want to see the fruits of our labor, right? To prove our worth as a minister. And it's something that I just did as we're recording this, a graphic I created for these Sunday social media posts that we do. One of our patroness, Mother Teresa, is one of our two main patronesses. And one thing that her famous quote is that God calls us to be faithful, not successful. And I think that's a hard pill to swallow. Like, I always think that, Tam, like you said, and Bob, like when you said, going back to somebody, like, I don't think we always hear those things. It's really nice when we do, that, you got to have the teen come to you later and say it. And whenever God does allow me to see fruit, I make sure to thank him and just tell him, like, you don't have to show me that, but you did. Oh. And I think when he does it, it's like, it is to encourage us, because sometimes I think he wants to like effectively praise us, to be like, I see all that you're doing and I appreciate that. And I love you. And sometimes like we just need to know, because man, the ministry game is a long game, and there's times where you want to give up, and there's times when you're discouraged, and there's times where, you're like, is there any money in this account? Like, whatever, like there's just all these things that happen, like, over the course of ministry. It's just, we all go through it. Right. But, or you're like, hello, is this thing on? Like, is anyone like, wow, we got like one view, but like when God shows it to you, it's just so gracious of him. And I think that, you have to plant the seeds no matter what kind of soil. And when he asks you, and then just like leave it to him, to like, that could take 20 years to germinate. Some of these plants Father Joe's talked about take 100 years, or 3 years underground. You don't see anything. You think nothing is happening because that person didn't go, wow, your skills of rhetoric really got me, or like you made a great point by that zinger from the catechism, but you don't know what's happening in that person's heart. So sow it anyways, right?
Isn't it interesting? I'm referring back to the previous podcast about abundance and scarcity.
Yeah.
Sowing seeds is an abundant activity. There's no limit on the amount of seeds that we can sow and the amount of opportunities to sow them. It's not like I'm going to use up all my seeds here, so I have to hold on to them. That's the cool thing about sowing seeds. They replicate themselves all the time. I mean, that's the goodness of God. I mean, it really is the goodness of God. I'm one of my favorite young people, one of the most damaged, wounded young people I'd ever met in my youth program. I can remember saying to her one night after reconciliation, and she just sitting there and she just looked so sad. And I said to her, I said, I said, I am so convinced that God loves you that I too love you.
Hmm.
I said, I just want you to know that. Well, the secret,
Sure.
that just
Sure.
really, it's like, because I don't know if she'd ever heard that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting to know here we are, 25 years later, I think. And I saw on Facebook recently, she's married, 3 children. She's got joy in her face. It's like,
Yeah.
Tammy, it's the harvest. It's the harvest
Yep.
Yeah.
I would never see. So there's a positive use of technology right there. Is tapping into people's stories over time. So yeah, what a wonderful moment.
I love that.
Sharing your heart, sharing your seeds.
Let's go to a steadfast heart. And I like that the subtitle on this one is "The Worst Time to Sell Is at a Loss."
This chapter was not that they're not all personal,
Yeah.
but this one here, I referenced my mom and a good friend of mine, Lisa, and the whole idea about steadfastness includes both a dying and a healing. And when I was trying to unpack that image, I thought of it on both a personal level and an institutional level, me and the church.
Mm.
And on a personal level, maybe you or maybe some of the folks listening to this podcast, but I think one of the most powerful experiences in life is sitting with somebody who's dying, someone who knows they're dying. There's something about that. And I've had 3 or 4 opportunities to walk with people who knew they were dying, and I knew they were dying. In the book, I talked about my friend Lisa, who I talked to her. She told me, she called and said she has 3 months to live, cancer. I made it a point to call her every Thursday, every Tuesday. I had Tuesdays with Lisa to talk to her. Now, towards the end, she lived about another 7 or 8 months. She wrote a book about her dying.
Wow.
And it didn't matter whether it was Tuesday or Thursday because she didn't know the difference anymore. But I remember our last conversation when she said, I know it's soon. I know it's really soon. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, it's like, wow. To watch my mom die, and my mom was in hospice care for 11 months in my dad's house. And we put a hospital bed in the dining room. And for 11 months, my dad sat next to her bed, and he's my role model. He slept in the chair next to her bed because he didn't want her ever to wake up and be afraid. And my mom was semi-conscious, rarely fully conscious. And then just recently, just last year, a good friend of mine, John, died of cancer, brain cancer. And when he told me he had brain cancer, I made it a point. I said, John, I'll call you every Tuesday. So somehow capturing that, the book by Mitch Albom, Tuesdays with Maury, I just held on to that idea of picking a day and touching base with my friends, with my mom. But in the book, I talk about how my mom was at home in hospice, but my wife Maggie was in the hospital because of surgery.
Yeah.
And I thought that what an interesting interplay between dying and healing, that both of them include those stages of simply sitting with, waiting, watching, worrying,
Yeah.
feeling powerless. I mean, really, it's all part. I think it's part of the dying and the healing process. And what a gift it is when we're willing to do that. It's almost like the willingness to be powerless. There's probably something in there about Jesus on the cross. The willingness to be powerless, to just sit. And on a personal level, what did we know? Healing takes time.
Yeah.
Dying takes time.
Yeah.
We got to put into time. And maybe it's about, maybe one of the spiritual virtues here is patience. Just patience. Just sitting with, knowing you can't control it, you can't change it, you can't make it different. you sit, you wait, you listen, you worry, you pray, you watch. That's what you do. And
Yeah.
so I think part of the spiritual journey involves us doing that on a very personal level and on an institutional church level.
Well, your approach to it, Bob, is I think what's so critical here is that you were willing to be powerless and willing to wait. And I think that that's a struggle for people, as you see with assisted suicide and these type of things where people just want to take it in their own hands. I don't want to watch people suffer. I mean, that, well, this is the tearjerker chapter for me, because, I was there with my mom when she was on hospice. And then, Bob knows that, was journeying with me when my dad was going through his final days too. And so I've been able to be there, with them in those moments. And it is hard to accept, these are the people that are heroes to me. You're seeing them diminish. You're knowing that your time there's an expiration date now. We have it. We see that it's coming. You noted the difference between Maggie and your mom was that we knew the outcomes were going to be different, right? We knew that mom was going home. Maggie was going to recover, and it is different when you know that somebody's not going to recover, just like when you were talking with your friend Lisa and your Tuesdays with her and your friend John and everything. And in those, moments, I remember, my last with my dad, my last conversation with him, you never forget, that. And we were in the hospital and we were going to take him to the long-term care. And so we had to fill out paperwork. And at that point, because he had already been on life support, we decided that he was that we were going to do a do not resuscitate on him, which had never been before. And my brother and I had to make that decision. And then my brother went home to Florida. So it was just me, and my niece was there from Florida, and she was, like 20. And so I'm in this room and, we're having this conversation, and I'm like telling my dad, that he was actually lucid and they wanted him to sign this paperwork. And I wanted to see if he could do it himself because he hadn't been lucid before to make the decision himself. And when I asked him, he was like, hey, we've already talked about this, I thought he was going to put up a fight, and stuff. And then I was like, Dad, you understand what they're going to do. And you've already been through this before. And this is extenuating circumstances now, Yeah. And he was like, looked at me, he was like, are you going to be okay? He was worried about me, because he's going on, right? And I'm going to be the one. I just wanted to let him know, I've seen you hang in through this stuff, man. It's been so hard for so long, so many months. And I just want to let you know that, you don't want to say, yeah, I'm going to be okay once you die. I don't want to be okay. I don't know if I'm going to be okay, but you have to tell them, I know I'm going to be okay. Why? Because my faith lets me know that I'm going to be okay. God, you're going to be with God. That's the goal, man. You got there. And that's where I want to be with you. And that's how you raised me, and stuff. So I'm going to be okay. And I just don't want you to suffer anymore, Dad. And my dad died the next day, and nobody said he's in his final 2 weeks or anything like that. With my mom, we knew it was imminent, but with my dad, none of us were even at his bedside at that moment, and stuff. It was just a crazy thing. They even tried to resuscitate him after we said, do not resuscitate. I mean, it was just his time. And as we were driving to the hospital, and we're driving to that long-term care place, I just was nobody was with you, Dad. And I was just crying. And I just felt him say, your mom came for me and I had to go,
Oh, wow.
and my parents were reunited, and stuff. And so, yeah, that's why this was emotional to me, knowing that, in this, that the living and the dying and the healing that's happening through all of this, and it's about your perspective through it. And just like you said, Bob, it was if you go in and you're like, this stinks, I hate this, I don't want to let go, I hate watching people suffer, I hate suffering, I hate cancer, I hate this, I hate that, then it's going to be so miserable. But if you can start to look through the eyes of faith and accept this and say, this is a part of life, and I'm going to see the beauty of Jesus and God, and we'd experience miracles during that time. We experienced love. We experienced some of the best moments ever. It's part of it. It's just so dang hard, but it's so incredibly beautiful. It's sacred.
Yeah, it's sacred. It is. It's sacred.
I think the other part of that too is, and I've said this to people before, how we walk alongside people in their own grief. I always say this, I have 5 children, and it's always nice when you first have the baby and there's so many people that want to like hold the baby and bring you food but where the real friends are the ones that show up a month later when everybody else has gone back to life. And they're the ones that come over and they're like, I don't want to talk to you. I just want to clean your bathroom. Like, I'm not here. I just want to bring you a meal. And it's the same people that when you watch a race, there's like certain people that are at like the final, like the last 2 miles. And it's like, because they know that that's where you need them. You need them when you're exhausted and you're burnt out and you just want to finish, that they carry you home, And I think it's beautiful that we can have the friends that are there with us at the beginning, and then we can have our diehard friends that are helping us cross the finish line, in whatever way that looks.
It's a great image. And even at the beginning, when I said that, I apply that same image to my relationship with the church.
Yes.
Certainly in my work and in my research, I talk all the time with, I heard the stories of those who are frustrated with the institutional church, that sometimes our failings as a church are more obvious, even more blatant than the good things that the church does. Sometimes that's what happens. But I think institutions inherently are human. And so there's a woundedness to institutions as well. And I believe when I think about the church, when I'm frustrated with some of the things that the church does, I remind myself that that's the institutional church. It's not the inspirational church.
Yeah.
And so, and I know there's a lot of question right now, is church dying or healing? But my process is the same.
Yeah.
Sit with, watch, worry, support, pray. That I need to do that because this is my church. This is my church that I love. And it's the church that has walked with me on my journey. And so now I feel like I'm walking with the church on its journey. And one of the things I say this about parenting, but this is not a book about parenting. I say about parenting, as a parent, you always play for the long haul.
Yeah.
You play for the long haul. You play for the fourth quarter. Don't give up early. Don't give in early. Well, I believe with the church, play for the long haul.
Yeah.
And one of the ways I do that personally is I make sure I surround myself with like-minded companions. I call it hanging with my companions on the journey. I need to be with that inspirational church, those people for whom their faith is so important. I think of my faith community at my parish. I think of my dinner club, my prayer group that's been meeting every once a month for over 30 years now. I have an inspirational church that's really, really important to me. And I hold on to those gospel seeds, the seeds of compassion and goodness, the seeds of mercy and forgiveness, the seeds of justice. I hold on to the seeds so that when the structure is driving me nuts, I think of that as soil. I want to hold on to the seeds. I think that's the critical piece here for me. And anyone who's ever read through scripture or you read through church history, you know that history as a church is really shaky. I mean, it really is shaky. We have moments in our church when you look at that, if you're in organizational development, you're thinking, there's no reason for this organization to exist. Really, they're really not. But we're still here. And what that says is that even in the midst of those weeds and the thorns, the Spirit is present. And so I think it's real critical for us, just like with individuals who are going down that healing, dying path. I believe that with the church, we're called to be that witness of presence to a wounded church. We need to be a witness of presence as struggling disciples. And I'll close this little piece with this. My favorite quote about hope and faith comes from a South American theologian, Rubem Alves. And he said in his book, the book's called Tomorrow's Child, he said, hope is hearing the melody of the future. Faith is dancing to it today. Hope is hearing the melody of the future. The future can work. The kingdom wins. Just like Jesus on the cross, death does not win. Been there, done that, no fear. The future works. The kingdom wins. And I so believe in that melody, I choose to live it now. That's what faith is. So my mom is dying. I know the ultimate outcome. I believe in the heavenly kingdom. I believe in that. When John was dying, I believe in that. I believe in the outcome. I can have a faithful witness of presence in the here and now because I believe in the outcome.
Steadfastness. Exactly.
Well, I wanted to share, it's interesting as we look ahead at chapter 11, Holy Heart. Since Little with Great Love started 4 years ago, Lisa and I would talk back and forth about how I'm a beer and she's a doer. And we have just been allowed in such beautiful ways in our friendship that she has encouraged me to, and by the way that you would describe it, she has had more of a prophetic voice in my life, that she's always encouraging me to tackle things, to do things. And I'm more of the poet voice in her life that's like, okay, but let's think about what this has done for you. Let's talk about, the essence of what you've been going through. And there's that beautiful, I think, dichotomy that you share in this chapter about how we can't be one or the other, but that there's kind of this call that we both have, right, to be, just like we're priest, prophet, and king, that there's a call to be the poet, but also be the prophet. And can you speak a little bit to that in this chapter?
I tell you, it's been one of my favorite images. It has, and because I've had the opportunity to speak on those two images in a variety of ministerial settings. And I think it's really, I really do think it's really important about the balance of poetic stillness and prophetic action. I think this is really an important balance. Succinctly, the prophet says, don't just sit there, do something. And the poet says, don't just do something, sit there. And I know for a lot of us, one or the other, maybe both, are really difficult challenges. Like, oh yeah, you
Agreed.
just sit there, but I'll change the world. That kind of thing. That's what the prophet is thinking. And the poet is thinking, yeah, you go ahead and try to change the world and you'll be burned out in a year. I'll still be here, because I'm grounded. But what I like about the poets measure time differently. I mean, this is really probably the best way for us to think about poetic moments. Think of those times in your life. What were you doing when you said to yourself, where did the time go? Think of the experiences, the events, the people. What were you doing when you were not conscious of the time at all? It just kind of blew past you. Because poets measure time differently. Poets measure in terms of, we might measure the time, like for me here on the East Coast, 3:54 p.m. I know what time it is here. But poets, they measure time third quarter, second hand in cards, third act in a play. I mean, you see, they measure differently. Seventh inning. They're the people who will stand in front of in a art museum. They'll stand in front of a painting for minutes on end and maybe longer, staring at the same painting, same piece of sculpture. The way we see art. I have sat and looked at mountains, canyons, rivers. People do that. I mean, people do this. We've all had poetic moments. Think of sitting on your front porch swing watching the hummingbirds. Oh yeah, that's my most recent poetic thing. But think about being on retreat and not paying attention to time. Think of meals that you've had with friends where the time just passes.
Yeah.
And I think those meals are Eucharistic with a small e. I do. The whole idea of poetic time, it's Sabbath time. We had said earlier in the podcast about living fast or living deep. Sabbath people live deep. We don't pay attention to the time because the experience is that important. Because living deep is a time of recreation, not just recreation. It's a time of delight and joy, festivity and wonder. But it's got to be balanced. It's got to be balanced by poetic action. It does. Because my fear is this. If the prophet avoids the poetic dimension, it can lead to frustration and despair. If the poet avoids the prophetic dimension, it can lead to avoidance, a Pollyanna life, even apathy, because we're not paying attention. And so I had a T-shirt one time that says, if you're really paying attention, you should be outraged. So I keep, that's my prophet shirt. That's my prophet shirt.
Nice.
Because if we really are paying attention, we should be outraged. And what prophets do, and I know that nobody runs out to be a prophet, and mindlessly, because there's a cost. I shared once before that prophets have to be believed or killed. It's a tough job description. Think of our social and spiritual prophets over our history. Most of them have tough endings. But what prophets do through their action, what they do, and I think being prophetic is a audible activity. It's a vocal activity. We become the audible voice of God when we start asking questions like it's one thing to be of service and say, I'm going to feed hungry people. But the prophet says, why are there hungry people? It's a thing to say, I'm going to go minister to the homeless. But the prophet says, well, why are there homeless? Prophets want to say, prophetic teachers, I want to say, why is it our schools don't have all the resources that teachers need? I can collect books, I can collect pens, I can collect backpacks, but the prophet asks the hard, challenging, irritating question.
Yeah.
You see the balance, prophet and poet.
Yeah.
Prophets can be annoying, irritating, and challenging.
Yeah.
But that's who we are. And that's who the Catholic Church is. We are poetic. I mean, our rituals are poetic, our art, retreats, contemplation, all that is poetic. But we are also a church that engages the world. We are a church of Catholic relief services that ministers in 90 different countries. We are a church of Catholic charities here in the United States. We are a church every day in the United States, every day, 1 million hungry people eat in Catholic institutions every day. 1 out of every 6 hospital beds in the United States is in a Catholic hospital. We created the school systems. Up until John Baptist de La Salle, only the wealthy kids were educated, and they were private tutors in their home. John Baptist de La Salle said, this is his language, we have to educate the street urchins. Now, I never called a kid a street urchin, but I know exactly what he meant. But you see, he wanted to know why those kids weren't educated. That's a prophetic voice. You see that? So we institutionally, and we as individual disciples of Jesus, we're called to balance the prophet and the poet. The prophet says, don't just sit there, do something, but make sure it's based in, don't just do something, sit there.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we hear the voice of God.
Absolutely. This is I hate to have to wrap up here, but it is our time. And I think that some other important aspects of this chapter really are get into Sabbath, living the Sabbath, and that it's not a day, that this is actually an attitude, attitude. Yep. And that we're attuned to holiness. So I hope that you guys will pick that up in your own reading. And I want to thank you guys for such a lively conversation today. We all got, I think, a little emotional, maybe at some point, or passionate,
right?
Definitely. And I think that just enriches, the content here. So I appreciate, having these conversations with you guys. It's always a joy to me.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Just wonderful.
So I want to thank you all for joining us on this great adventure of the Heart of a Disciple podcast. And we pray that it's really been a source of nourishment and renewal and restoration to your spirit. So let's keep moving forward in faith on this journey. And we pray for you guys, and we ask you to pray for us, that our hearts may remain open so that God can fill them with abundance and teach us how to be good disciples. All right. We'll see you next time on our final podcast.
Hello, I'm Paul McMahon, the president and publisher at Wholeness Press, where we strive to publish books that will enrich the spirituality of our readers at the intersection of faith and culture. On behalf of the press, we are delighted to be the publisher of this book, The Heart of a Disciple by Bob McCarty, and to sponsor the engaging series of podcasts based on the book. The Heart of a Disciple encourages readers to listen to their hearts and to nurture their spiritual lives as they grow in discipleship and minister to others on their journey in faith. We hope that you will enjoy these podcasts. You can purchase a copy of The Heart of a Disciple on our website at paulistpress.com. Thank you.